What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Cressey Performance podcast, where we feature our customers, who they train, and how they train them. I'm your host, Will Waterman, head of human performance and sports science at Cressey Motion, and we have a special episode for you today. This episode is a conversation that Eric Cressey and I had on a Twitter space about a new data insight that we just gained by looking at all of our data that we've recorded over the last basically 2 years, looking at his particular branded test we call the Cressey Performance Test. That's a standardized test on our system that was basically, the data looks at over 150 locations that have Proteus, and we're looking specifically at males 20 to 30. We'll get into the details in the episode, so I won't fill the intro time here with that information, but this is a really cool special deep dive into what our data is finally saying about testing and training across different planes with different movement patterns, as well as looking at different areas of the body. And so it's a really cool episode. It's a special one in that we're also doing this in basically as a lead up to the launch of a new feature we're about to release on the Proteus system, which is going to allow you to classify and movement based on their power versus acceleration performance. So essentially, we're going to be able to tell people where they should be training on the force velocity curve. Should they be training certain parts of their body with high force, low velocity movements, or should they be training other areas of the body with low force, high velocity movements? We're going to be surfacing that information right up to the top so that trainers can see this information easily, and we're even going to give you recommended exercises that you do for each particular movement category that you look at. So say you're looking at horizontal pushing movements and you get classified as low strength, we're actually going to give you exercises, suggestions that aren't just on Proteus. These are things you can do in the gym to improve that performance for that particular movement pattern. So anyways, special episode, really fun talking to Eric. He's always a wealth of information. And with all that being said, let's just jump right in. How are you, man?
Very good. How about yourself?
I'm good. Where are we talking to you from today?
I am in New York. So
okay. And here's the the irony is that I am within 10 minutes of Cressey Sports Performance. So.
Oh, there you go. We flip-flop. There you go, man.
Yeah, man. I know the timing was kind of funny, but hey, you guys you're up there for the Yankees, right? So
yes, sir.
What's game 2? It's tomorrow?
It's supposed to be tomorrow. We're going to see. Hopefully the weather cooperates with us. But
all right.
We'll find out soon enough, but that's the hope.
Yeah, man. Well, hey, thanks for doing this. I'm going to wait just another minute or two to let people join up. Have you done a Twitter space before?
Yeah, it's been a while, but definitely did it back in the day.
Awesome, man. Awesome. Yeah, I think this is a fun kind of new medium they got going on here. But so I'll just kind of jump in. I kind of want to set the stage a little bit for everyone who's joining up, and we can also kind of fill things in. But I think the idea here is that we want to kind of get into this discussion. At the end, we will kind of open it up for questions. So at the end of the conversation, if everyone who's listening, if you want to request to speak, you can just hit that request to speak button. When we get to the end, we might nominate you and take a couple questions and before we sign off. So with that being said, let's jump in. Anything else you want to add, Eric, before we jump in?
Actually, more of a question. Do you want me to mute myself while you're talking and vice versa, or what do you think?
Nah, man. I think it's good. Okay. I think it's good. As long as it sounds okay for you, then I think we're ready to roll.
Sure.
All right, cool. So I'm just kind of set the stage here a little bit. And Eric, also feel free to jump in at any point. So as we all know, there hasn't been an accurate and practical way to evaluate strength and speed across the entire body, particularly for multi-planar rotational movements. We were talking to Eric because, he's been someone that's been at the forefront of measuring and working at improving multiplanar movements for years. But our team has been working for a while now, over the last several months, at building this new software that looks at millions of different data points recorded during a Proteus performance test. And after all this years of recording all this great data and working with some of the greatest trainers in the field, like you. We've reached a big new milestone in making sense of the first and only data set of physical strength for every human movement. So what we wanted to talk with you about is how we've now done a little data dive into this data over the last couple of years. And basically, we've applied this new engine that we've built and looked at this massive historical database, which has produced new normative data and very valuable findings on the relationship between strength and speed for athletes for all planes of movement. And that's why we're talking to you, because you have been doing this stuff for a long time. And for those who don't know, which I assume probably most of the people on here know who you are, but I'll just do very, very quick bio. Eric is the owner of Cressey Sports Performance. He's has 2 locations. It's an elite training facility in Florida and Massachusetts. And he serves as the director of player health and performance for the New York Yankees. So if you missed the intro, that's why he's in New York right now, getting ready for game 2 against the Guardians. And he's been at the forefront of talking about the importance of testing and training across the force velocity curve and triplanar movements for years. I mean, I know I've talked to you about this before, but I've been following all your work for a long time. You've said for years that you're only going to be strong in the planes that you train. You know what I mean? And that, but now what we are trying to provide is the ability to actually investigate that in depth, right? And have the data to kind of really look into those questions. And we have endless applications for this data in areas to explore. But we want to start with you with just exploring these main 3 that we've looked into. You and I have kind of gone over this before, but with your performance staff and a little bit with the Yankees. But the main things we want to talk about tonight, and we'll kind of get into more depth with each of them, and really want to get your take. But first, do athletes have significant imbalances in strength and speed, right? And short answer is what we found is yes. And we saw a huge difference. So we won't spoil everything, but we found that athletes do have large differences in strength and speed. And this is something you've been saying for a long time. And it really speaks to the importance of training across the force velocity curve. So we'll investigate that. We're also going to look at that and how that difference applies in different planes. So does the sagittal plane does performance in the sagittal plane translate to performance in the frontal or the transverse plane? And the quick answer there is we don't see a translation between the sagittal plane performance and performance in the frontal and transverse plane. But again, we'll get into that detail a little bit more in the discussion. And then this one, I won't give you kind of hint, but there's a certain area of the body or certain movement category for a certain area of the body where we see the highest proportion of low strength. So, we'll keep that kind of as a mystery. So we'll make people listen a little bit longer, but there's one body area or region in particular that has the highest proportion of individuals that have low strength. So I'm just going to keep you guys in the dark for now. We'll get into it later, but kind of the last little setup piece here is I want to kind of describe what we did. And then Eric, I want to jump right into kind of the findings and kind of get your take on what these findings really mean. So what we did, and again, just the setup for everyone listening, is we first, Proteus is this, device that can measure movement in 3 dimensions, right? We can test all these different movements. So we developed a test we call the Cressey Performance Test because we worked with you to develop it. And it's a standardized test on the Proteus software that we developed about 2 years ago. And it's been very, very popular and used across a bunch of different sites with thousands of test takers. And we've finally got this huge database, and this is what we're analyzing. We literally looked at over 7,000 tests comprising over 1.2 million reps. And for everyone who hasn't taken the Cressey test, I assume there are a lot of people haven't. It's a rotational athlete bias test, so it's really geared towards looking at the performance of a rotational athlete. It's 17 movements, takes about 6 minutes to complete, and we can get into the exercises in particular. But long story short, it involves a push-pull, PNF flexion extension, trunk rotation, lateral bounce, look at leg power, vertical jump, and then a full body rotational shot put to just look at full body rotational power. And the particular data set we're going to talk about was an analysis we did on just males 20 to 30, because that's definitely the data set we have the most confidence in across over 150 plus locations that have done this test. So it's 616 individual tests with more than 50,000 reps. So Eric, did I miss anything in the setup? Anything else you want to add as far as, significance of the test, or, why we developed that test?
No, I think you nailed it. It's pretty
okay.
Thorough.
All right, cool. So the first thing we wanted to kind of look at is, do athletes possess imbalances in strength and speed? Okay. And here's what we found is that of the athletes that possess baseline strength, 51% are dominant in strength. They are stronger than they are fast. Whereas 26% are speed dominant, which is faster than they are strong. So that means, add those two together, 77% of the athletes you found with foundational strength have an imbalance of their strength or speed, right? So a question for you, Eric, what kind of speed imbalances do you see? What are the most common stuff that you see in your gym?
Yeah, I mean, I've told this story probably a million times, but like the classic example of, the high school athlete that goes off to a Division I program, it's a pitcher throwing, 87 to 89, gets to college, gets a ton stronger, puts on 40 pounds in 2 years. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden they're 92 to 94. And then they just stay the same. They stop improving. Uh-huh. And certainly it's closer to genetic potential and things like that. But what we see is that, strength kind of buys you a seat at the table, but it doesn't necessarily, help you get to that next level. It's more about how you utilize that force. In many cases, a lot of athletes get banged up trying to chase, kind of your classic heavy bilateral sagittal plane lifts.
Right.
So I think the thing that, we recognize very quickly is that, it's one thing to develop force. It's another thing to actually use it well in a sports-specific context rotationally, and then also to display it, quickly. And this test obviously gives us a lot more insights where, we'll see athletes that have, great power numbers, but might have really, really low acceleration numbers, which is pretty eye-opening, particularly when it's kind of combined with some of the scores that, are not as good when we actually add like counter movement, where they should be using the stretch shortening cycle efficiently, or, the fascial system for some of its elasticity. So I think that's where the balances show up, is that, strength kind of like takes you from high school to college. But, when you look at pro guys, they don't necessarily thrive compared to college athletes on the strength side of things. What they thrive on is the ability to use that strength, quickly and at the right time.
Right. Yeah. And actually, it's so interesting. We're starting to look at that data between college, high school, and professional. And we actually are seeing that same thing that I know that you've been saying that for years, but we're actually seeing that play out in the data, where there's a clear jump from high school to college, but then there isn't a huge jump in, power and strength from the college ranks to pro. So, it's something that we're actually see play out in the data. But it's also, really, really interesting. And do you see that individuals that have particularly the strength dominance, like what does that actually look like as far as their suboptimal performance? Like what is it that you're seeing either on the field or even in the gym, if they are kind of a lot stronger than they are fast? Like what does that translate into?
Yeah, I think that's the problem, is it doesn't translate into much athletic. They tend to be kind of weight room superstars that for whatever reason don't throw hard, don't necessarily hit the ball hard, and I think that's the challenge. Is so when you see an athlete that I kind of talked about like the classic like Division I experience of you got 25 power racks in a weight room and everybody just squats, benches, deadlifts, and does rows. Like we get them often when they get to pro ball and put them on an aggressive medicine ball throwing program. They start doing more Proteus. Certainly we look at the deliveries and things like that, but we're doing rotational rows and just attacking things a different way, more single leg work. And it's a little step back from what they've traditionally done. You see guys often take big steps forward, and you have to ask yourself the question is like, did they get better just because I removed a stimulus that was inherently making it harder for them to rotate? Like, I think we could probably agree, like, a lot of those like dudes that are squatting 405 with like crazy wide infrasternal angles, like probably aren't great rotators, and lifting is making them worse. Whereas there are other athletes that might get better just because we removed a crazy fatigue stimulus from them, where they were like kind of constantly pushing too hard and using their bullets in the wrong place, or we actually, integrating stuff that allowed them to be more successful because we capitalized on deficits in certain areas on that force velocity curve. I tend to think it's probably a combination of all of them. But the question would be is like, how many of these guys would have got better if they just stopped training altogether? Like how many were getting better just by not doing the things that were potentially harmful for them? I doubt it's that many of them. So I do tend to lend a little bit more, credence to the idea that, the training rotation hard makes a big difference as long as it's done at the right speeds with the right implements.
Right. And what we're trying to do here is basically just make that, you've been saying this for years that, especially there's a bias towards, people chasing strength, right? Chasing the weight room.
Yeah.
And we've, obviously this data kind of leads, credibility to that statement, right? That, a majority of who we saw were faster or were stronger than they were fast. Right. And this is hopefully going to help people, help, trainers and help, athletes figure out exactly where they need to train along the force velocity curve. So like, obviously these individuals that are really already have that baseline strength, they already have, this strength dominance, they need to be training down at the bottom end of the curve, right? Is that like as a generalization, that's kind of what we're trying to find here and help pick that out.
Yeah, I think you need to make sure you emphasize that. Like we're talking about the qualities that should predominate in the training, but nothing, should ever be fully excluded. Like there's no reason they shouldn't preserve their base level strength, but we do know that strength tends to stick around really easily. I mean, you can deadlift heavy once every 4 to 6 weeks, and it's probably going to hang out. Whereas power tends to detrain really, really quickly. And, a lot of athletes would be well served to attack that a little bit harder, particularly in kind of rotational patterns. That's something that's always blown my mind is like, we'll have athletes that'll do 3 days a week of kind of like slightly higher load, like strength speed stuff on Proteus. And then they'll use med balls on like the other 3 days a week for like, almost like a speed strength dynamic, and they handle it incredibly well. Like I'm always blown away. You'd never deadlift an athlete 6 days in a week, but you can attack them from a rotational standpoint. Right. I mean, they all go out and take slap shots, take BP, throw baseballs, throw footballs, play tennis. Like they do that daily. So it probably shouldn't be surprising to me, but I've always been surprised at how hard we can push them without, potentially setting them back or getting them hurt or having them feel like they're exhausted.
Right. And that's really the thing that part of what we're trying to do here is just make also that measurement more, easy to access, right? So that if you want to train that person, 3 times a week, you can actually use Proteus not only to train it and actually load in those planes, but also monitor that, their output, right? Their level of effort, right? Which is like, even with a med ball, med balls, I was in there today. I was in your gym today. People were banging those against the wall, but something really cool is we can actually give you a number, right? Are you hitting the numbers that you need to be hitting? Are you, was that last rep lower than the rep before, right? You can, we're starting to really work on being able to help athletes find that correct zone a lot more easily. And this is just the first step for us in trying to basically, delegate which athletes need to be training which part of the force velocity curve and how often. So, and actually that's a good segue talking about planes and loading in the correct planes into this kind of the next main finding that we had looking at this data, which was that, we compared all these movements. So we looked at all your movements in the Cressey Performance test, and we divided them up into sagittal plane, frontal plane, and transverse plane movements. And this, you even alluded to this earlier, so it's not going to surprise many who are listening, but the sagittal plane has way fewer individuals that fell into the strength deficient classification, right? So way fewer individuals actually had needed to work on foundational strength in the sagittal plane. When you compare that to looking at the frontal and transverse plane, they obviously had way more individuals that fell into the strength deficient classification, right? And then kind of if we look at the top performers, so look at the other end of the curve, the sagittal plane had more individuals that fell into the kind of this strength dominant classification, whereas the frontal and transverse plane had a much lower fewer individuals that fell into this dominance. So basically what it's really saying is, sagittal plane movements had both kind of fewer people that fell into that low level need for foundational strength, and they had people more at the high end performing better at higher levels of power and acceleration. So, I don't think this is surprising, right? So, like, is that jive with what you've observed in the field with your athletes, that sagittal plane movements tend to be more well-trained compared to these, other planes?
Yeah, I mean, you get what you train, right? And those opportunities are plentiful in a classic weight room. Like, I mean, that's just the nature of gravity and the equipment that we're afforded, and that's obviously why I think Proteus is kind of changing the game. Is that you're able to train in the vectors, that you actually want to perform in, and that traditionally has, even with med ball stuff, right? Like the load goes down due to gravity, whereas with Proteus, you do a shot put on a Proteus and the line of pull is more horizontal, which is a total difference maker. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a surprise at all. It's good to just have the data that verifies that it's actually the case.
Right. And I think what's really cool about this for me is, you've been saying this for years, right? But the hard thing is like a lot of people still don't quite understand this, and really what it boils down to is, if you're looking at the sagittal plane only and you're testing that, right, you're looking at movements like, vertical jumps and bench press and things like that, those don't translate necessarily into that frontal and transverse plane, right? So you could be missing or doing your athletes a big disservice if you're not assessing and looking at movements in these other planes, right? And this is what this actually is starting to show. And we know that there have been ways to do that, but and measure that performance, but it isn't easy, right? Typically, and that's one of the things we're trying to solve for. So, I mean, do you think does this matter for baseball players only? I mean, does it matter for only these elite athletes, or do you think that there's something to this, discovering these differences in sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane that we can apply even to other groups? Do you think there's, other applications for this type of information?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're also doing is we're effectively measuring, how do some of these non-contractile elements potentially contribute to, athletic performance? Like, we don't know that all this is just coming from musculotendinous contributions. Chances are we're actually, challenging a pretty finely tuned fascial system, someone that effectively transfers force from the lower body to the upper body, or vice versa, obviously in some cases too. So I do think from a training standpoint, we're investigating a little bit more than we get with just a bunch of barbells and things like that. And, some of your classic like force plate jumps and vertical jump tests, which tend to happen in really like one plane of motion, which, isn't really representative of what happens in athletes. So I don't think we ever throw out all the other tests. Like, some of those classic strength measures are important.
Sure.
I still love force plates. Things like dynamometers, goniometers, like these things all have a place. This is, Proteus is a piece to the puzzle, but it's a vital piece because it wasn't an area that we could traditionally assess. Like, it wasn't throwing a med ball, against the wall with a radar gun reading it. Like, it's not giving us what we're getting from Proteus. Like, it's much more built out. And it speaks a lot more to, how we're actually developing force and more importantly, like what we need to do to develop our athletes differently.
Right. And that's really our goal, right? Is really surfacing this information and making it easier to access, right? I think that's really what we've been trying to develop for a long time. We've been working previously at just making basically improving the software, improving the product to be able to actually test these movements. But now we're trying to actually surface these findings. Because as you know, historically, you look at a Proteus like results screen, and it takes a lot of interpretation. You know what I mean? Like, you have to look at all this data and like read all these numbers. And now what we're trying to do with some of the software is, when you get done with a test, it'll tell you exactly where you should train along give you basically an inference or an idea of where you should train, which, movements across the force velocity kind of spectrum. And actually this new feature, which I know we've kind of given you a little preview of, it's actually going to also recommend the types of exercises and basically give you a suggestion of, how you should be loading these movement patterns and what type of exercise selection you can use also off of Proteus. Right. So we're not just doing this to like improve your training on Proteus and say, hey, Proteus is the answer for everything. It's more like, hey, let's give you all these exercises or all these ideas of things that you can do to improve, and constantly monitor so that it's, you're not missing some big piece of the puzzle, right? Because like, as you know, especially over the course of a season or things like that, people are always, changing, and, injuries and all this stuff, recovery. So we want to always make sure we're, monitoring those things and surfacing those insights. So now this brings me to the kind of this last thing I want to discuss here today, which was which part of the body had the highest proportion of low strength. So people that fell into the low strength bucket. So I'm sure no one here is going to be too surprised, but the answer was our rotational core movements. So the core had the largest proportion of individuals that fell into the low strength bucket compared to the upper body and lower body. So we divided everything into, basically all the upper body tests, all the lower body tests. And we basically saw that no matter how we sliced and diced the data, the core always has the highest proportion of individuals that need to work on baseline strength, and had the lowest that fell into this kind of lowest proportion of individuals that fell into the strength dominant classification. So basically at the higher levels of performance, there was fewer individuals that had cores that were, basically performing at those higher levels as well. So, first off, I guess I'll ask this question first. Why do you think this is? Like, what do you think is the reason that we see this with the core in particular compared to upper body and lower body?
Limited equipment access and limited exercise capabilities. There's just fewer ways that you can actually train it. Whereas, you can develop sagittal plane prowess in a million different ways, and everybody knows how to do it. You largely live your life in the sagittal plane, right? You drive a car straight ahead, you walk straight ahead. You play sports in a very different realm, though.
Right. Yeah, and I think what's really interesting is you look at this and you compare this, especially when you look at on the force velocity curve, right? Like what we're basically saying is we see a need for training speed on the far right of the force velocity curve, with 25% of individuals in the sagittal plane falling into that, but only 13% for the core, right? So when you look at, the fact that, as you were saying kind of earlier, a lot of individuals, obviously have this need to train speed, right? They have the need to train speed. That is particularly true of sagittal plane, but not necessarily true for the core, right? The core, we're seeing kind of the opposite. We need a lot more on the upper end of the force velocity curve, with people needing to train, high force, low velocity type movements. And so, what do you think, like, is this something that has more to do, like you said, with, you think it's very difficult as far as type of equipment? But what do you think about this? Like, how does it apply to the actual competency of basically the nervous system, and you being able to perform that in a standing position? Because that's a big thing what we're doing here, right? We're actually measuring in the standing position.
Yeah. I think the first thing that we need to talk about is like what this like kind of core strength is. Like this is very different. I'm sure you have some physical therapists, and athletic trainers who are on here are familiar with McGill's work, where, spine range of motion, spine power, are positively correlated with injuries. So we're not saying like these are tests that are encouraging people to like isolatedly rotate, through their lumbar spine, to aggressively go and do like rotational core stuff. Like,
right.
What we're actually speaking to is core is something that involves like a rotational element that transfers, force from the lower body to the upper body. So something like a trunk twist or something like that, where what we're measuring really is how well you effectively transfer force from your lower body to your upper body. And those are the movements where athletes seem to be the least proficient. But we're not encouraging people just to go out and do like weighted sit-ups with 80 pounds behind their neck and chase spine strength, because that's a race to the bottom. So I do think it's important to kind of clarify.
Totally.
And I kind of went off kilter. What was your actual question? I just want to make that distinction before we.
Oh, no. The question was more just like, you actually kind of answered it in that is basically, if we're looking at this movement in particular, we're talking about rotational core movements, right? And I think a lot of this is not only a lack of the ability to load, but also potentially a lack of the nervous system and the body to perform these movements, and having these motor patterns be ingrained. Right. And that's part of what this is looking at too. When you compare that to the sagittal plane movements, whether it be lower body or upper body, these are things that you just practice so much, but we just don't get that same type of practice where we're trying to transfer force from the ground through their hands. So there's more of a question of, do you think that has something to do with it more than just maybe tissue quality by itself?
Oh, I think it absolutely makes a difference. And I'd even add to that, like, we even see like a learning effect on the test. You know what I mean? Like when we do like the straight arm plyo trunk rotations and stuff, like they're figuring out where to put their center of mass. Like there's almost like a little unstable element where they all kind of look like newborn giraffes on the first time they do a test. And then they come back and they do it again. There's market improvement. Whereas like some of the the rotational one arm press part of the test, like even just like the straight up upper body butt stuff where it's like basically the one arm like press row, like they pick it up very, very quickly. Rotation is different. And the analogy I use is like, think about it, no one ever had like a basketball coach that coached them on how to vertical jump. Like everybody gets how to jump because it's sagittal plane. You go down, you come back up, and then you just keep doing it until you're faster at it. But we see millions of hitting coaches, pitching coaches, tennis coaches, all that. Triplanar movement is complex. Like there's a lot of places things can go wrong. Lots of places where energy can leak. Lots of places where you can have limited range of motion that reduces your capacity to develop or transfer force. So I think that's why we see this being so deficient in folks, is they can't train it, and sometimes they never got the expert coaching cues that they need to actually understand how to effectively transfer force in that regard.
Yeah, and this is something I've heard you say before about, and I think hopefully everyone understands this is what we're trying to do. I think you've called us a rotational force plate, right? Which is essentially what we are, striving to be. Especially these measurements have been so hard to actually measure. We're trying to basically democratize that, right? We're trying to make the analysis of where people should train on the force velocity curve for these rotational movements. We're trying to make that more accessible. And I think versus things like these sagittal plane movements, there's so many ways to do it, right? There's so many ways that you can traditionally do that. So that's really been our focus. So do you think that the ability to measure that, especially more frequently and easily, is that significant as far as what the value that we're trying to bring there?
Yeah, I mean, what gets measured gets improved. So I think in general, across all the industries that in which we work, whether it's rehabilitation, strength and conditioning, certainly baseball, and a number of other sports, like everything is data driven nowadays. So the more objective measures that you can actually have, the better. I happen to think that this is an objective measure that shortens the loop to actual athletic performance. Like I see more value in getting some of these numbers potentially than just having force plate numbers. If we're talking about like hitting, throwing, don't get me wrong, those force plates can tell us a lot about exit velocities and long drive distance and how fast somebody's going to run. But when it comes to like rotational patterns, I do feel like these are probably more predictive.
Right, and we're just at the beginning of this exploration. That's something we are going to continue to look at those relationships between those actual sports performance metrics and see like. Are we actually seeing these correlations to our movements and to what? And we already are in the field, but we just got a lot more. We want to do a lot more big data, and that's something that we're really excited about. Our data is growing at roughly right now 10% a month. You know what I mean? So by the end of this year, we're going to be way far ahead than we were at the beginning, and and the types of individuals that we're measuring and assessing, it's going to go beyond. Baseball and all that, but that's obviously our huge baseball and golf is, definitely where we have the most number of athletes right now. So we have a little bit of a leg up. It just so happens those are rotational sports,
Absolutely.
So yeah. So, well, hey, I want to definitely open it up to questions, but, I think as a kind of quick kind of wrap up for what we found, what we're seeing is that there are these power and acceleration imbalances across the body and in different regions of the body, different planes. And what we're trying to do is make it easier to measure this stuff and allow for more personalized training. And we have this software product that's, feature, I guess you could say, on Proteus that's going to surface those things way easier. And this is going to create these actionable evaluation of strength and speed, across the entire body, no matter what kind of movement you're doing. And we're going to have a landing page tomorrow that we'll announce on Twitter that'll have all of this information, all the data, so that everyone listening can actually look at and take their time to digest. Some of this stuff's kind of not always just the easiest thing to describe in an audio medium. So we'll have all this in a written down so everyone can take a look and kind of slice and dice. So anyone there that wants to ask questions in the audience, feel free to go ahead and request, and we will take your questions, and Eric and I will do the best to answer them as we can. So if anyone wants to jump in and ask any questions, feel free to hit that request button now. And Eric, also, quick question while we wait to see if anyone wants to jump into the conversation here. When we talk about the Cressey test, right now, is there any way that you would change it? Coming up, any things that you would want to look at that you aren't looking at now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in an ideal world, I'd still love to shorten it even more.
Totally.
I mean, this is true of you. I think in general, strength coaches are biased towards wanting to always get the information you need so we can go right back to training. So I think that's just more a function of us testing athletes more regularly so that our coaches are more proficient, so you can run it in the 6-minute range, like we said, instead of it creeping up to 10 or 11. But no, I feel like it's a pretty thorough test, and it's necessarily expansive. You have to cover a lot of ground to get the information that you need. So
consider it done. We will. I'll get back to you on how we'll change it. We'll change it soon. All right. Looks like we got someone who wants to jump in. I think it's Curtis here. Go ahead, Curtis.
Yeah. Hey guys, thanks for doing this. This is really cool to hear. Sure. The compiling of data and explanation is really cool. I guess one of my questions is I got two, but the first one essentially was, this is concentric based movement. Do you feel like biasing the concentric aspect of, say, rotation or whatever it is, which is important for all athletes, do you think biasing just the concentric side of things could be, I guess, biased data, since we're not talking about essentially the stretch reflex? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'll answer for that one. So the first thing I would say is make sure you're kind of aware of the difference between like testing and training, right? So this is a testing initiative that looks at some big picture items, and the training is still going to have a huge element of eccentric, bias, particularly like at certain points in the off season where we want to hammer that home. Obviously isometric and eccentric probably, predominating the most early in the off season. The second aspect that I would say to that is there is an eccentric component to these tests, and it's particularly present in some of the counter tests. Is you have to change directions, so you can't go left to right without an eccentric, an amortization phase, and then a concentric in the opposite direction. So that's where, to me, the eccentric aspect of it comes in. Is if we have an athlete that tests poorly on a counter test, that's one thing I'm looking at, is maybe they don't actually have the eccentric braking force to be successful in this. And then they test amazing on the non-counter. That's one place where I'm really looking, like that may be an athlete that doesn't have like the trust in their, their rotary core control to actually create some hip shoulder separation. So I think that's the part of the test where I see it the most. But there is, going to be an element on like a vertical jump test. Like there's an eccentric component before you go up. It's just not going to be as heavy as, some other things that we look at.
For sure. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, the counter movement makes sense.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that. My second question was, you're talking about everybody's training, and I would say predominantly that's the case in the sagittal plane.
Yeah.
How much do you think a factor of everybody training, like you said earlier on, you use it or you lose it? How much of a factor do you think, like, people not actually having the ability to like transfer force from frontal to transverse or whatever it is, plays a factor in like the testing numbers, right? Like if somebody's never ever done, say one of your frontal plane tests, like are you looking for trends over time? Because if as they get acclimated to the test, they're probably going to get good at the test. So how much of a factor does that play of them not being able to like work through a triplanar movement of rotation?
I agree with you 100%. What I would tell you is we always try to do like a mini familiarization session with the athlete, just get in their hands, kind of feel the patterning and stuff like that before they actually get going. Do we sample every test in this overall power test? No, but 1,000%. I mean, that's the nature of it. We always did familiarization protocols when we were at the University of Connecticut during my grad degree. Like, particularly we did studies at time with like untrained, female college subjects who had never back squatted before. And like, you can imagine that they get really good at it really quickly. So I think that's a concern with any kind of like, initiative like this. So I tend to want to test as frequently as possible just so that I can make sure the trends are good. So in an off season, like I'll test guys every 6 weeks, historically on this just to kind of see how things are going. But that's an excellent point. It's a foreign movement to some people. So you want to get them less foreign, but then appreciate that they're probably going to get significantly better over the course of 6 weeks. But everything gets better over the 6 weeks too, when you stop playing baseball for a month and just focus on building your body back up.
Yeah, and actually, we actually saw that. We didn't mention that much in this particular in this talk, but we actually looked at Eric's off-season program, and we actually saw this take place. So we saw fewer people, a lot fewer people at the end of his off-season program fall into that kind of low strength bucket, and way more people fall into the high, kind of speed dominance bucket. So we actually saw, and that included in the core too, in these rotational movements. That's not just that was across the entire spectrum. So obviously loading and actually starting to train these patterns, you do start to see these changes happen over time.
One other thing I'd add, Curtis, too, is where this gets really powerful, if you have access to it, is when it's paired with a biomechanical analysis, whether that's something from like a high level lab where we use Thea markerless on the field, so we can get an appreciation for a lot of different things. Certainly looking at like force place data if you have it on a mound or something like that, because sometimes you'll see athletes that actually test really well on Proteus, and then you look at some of their biomechanical metrics, and there are things that you really like. Maybe they've got great lead leg blocking, maybe they've got great lead knee velocity, some of these things that you're like, man, they should throw harder. And then you go and look at the delivery, and it's like, oh, the direction from the back hip is atrocious. No matter how powerful he is rotationally, how well he tests on this, it's not going to work unless he actually cleans up his delivery. So sometimes it kind of helps you to that end of like, this guy's actually athletic enough to throw 97. He's just putting himself in terrible positions to actually be successful with it.
Right, yeah, because I get that aspect, right? So like Driveline years ago, I don't know if they still do it. I haven't talked to a bunch of guys that have trained or that have left and got picked up by big league clubs. They used to use a Kaiser rotational power test, and they found that if you were 50 psi and you're rotating, I think it was like 2,000 watts above, you should be able to touch 90. And that was the first goal. Or I might be getting those numbers wrong.
Yeah,
but like you'll see those things, but there's not that correlation. So so that makes sense. Yeah. Anyways, I appreciate it. I'll let
no worries, man.
Questions.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
Yeah, Coach Arminio says, hey, by the way.
Oh, nice. Send him my best.
Bro. All right, bro.
All right. Well, I'm not seeing anyone else. Oh no, wait, no, we got another one. I think we're going to have Will Franco jump on here, man. Will,
Nice.
you're up next.
BC baseball. There you
Let's
go.
go.
Hey guys, how's it going? Thanks for having me on. It's you guys are awesome. Eric, well, I have two questions for you. One is have you experimented at all with the Proteus during game day lifts? Eric, I know like at your facility you don't really have a game like atmosphere, but maybe like using it for like a primer lift. I use that a lot at BC. And my second question does when you do your evaluation and you're looking at like an athlete who's low force compared to an athlete who's high force, does that change your sprint work at all?
So first question, like at the facility, a lot of guys do like it as part of their pre-throwing routine, like even if it's just a little patterning stuff. Almost kind of works like you guys have probably seen like some of like the 3D strap stuff. A lot of guys like to use that kind of like the end of a warm up, just like add a little bit of load to the system once they've optimized hip rotation and stuff. So we'll do some of the the stuff with the yellow strap, and the guys seem to use Proteus in a very similar vein. It's probably just more that it's full body rotation as opposed to just like focusing on a hip or something like that. And then the second question you ask is how it relates to some of our sprint work. To me, not so much. To me, I'll probably borrow more from our sagittal plane strength stuff, in terms of that stuff. Probably mostly in the context of how much we prioritize it, how much volume we do. Like if we have a guy who's really strong, but he's kind of like your classic slow strong, I'm probably going to sprint him more, both in terms of frequency and, and obviously like number of reps and all that stuff. For me, Proteus is telling me something about, a little bit differently, and have access to the force plate data can help with that. Like certain force plate metrics seem to predict sprint velocity, better. So in this case, like Proteus it's a screwdriver, which is super useful for certain things. And, the force plate might be a hammer that's good for some other things.
Right. Yeah. Although it is interesting, we have started to look at this comparison between force plate data and Proteus data. And we have a little study that we'll release coming out soon that actually showed some high correlations to our vertical jumps to some force plate data jumps. So that's a good call. Stay tuned to that. It's definitely obviously a different measurement. We're measuring not at the ground, so we're measuring it at the torso, because of the way you have to hold the bar. But what is interesting is we have seen we are able to still classify people as, in this, being someone is being slow or force deficient versus having a lot of speed. So I think we'll be able to do that actually pretty decently. I don't know if we'll ever be at the level for that particular movement as some other devices, but we're gonna definitely get at least 80% of the way there. You know what I mean? So we can give you a lot of that good data. So and it definitely, we're trying to make it easier to jump into that data versus sometimes I know those force plates can be a little annoying to jump into. So Will, stay tuned. We'll try to, we're going to have that stuff become available there too. And I think you'll find once this feature comes out, it'll give you some of that same information. Maybe not to the extent of being able to predict right off the bat your sprint speed, but we might get there, who knows, so we'll see. So, well, yeah, thanks for those questions. I'm not seeing anyone else. Let me just take a quick scroll, make sure I'm not missing anyone else. Eric, I know I really appreciate your time and jumping on. And I know you've got a hectic, probably a few weeks coming up here, hopefully, right? Hopefully. So thanks so much for joining tonight. And, like I said, everyone everyone who's on here who's got a Proteus, we got this new feature coming out soon. For those of you that don't, stop sleeping on it. Get one. we're going to have this coming out soon. Okay. So appreciate it, Eric. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Thanks. Take care.